again, and good evening, everybody. Glad we're logged in for another Tuesday night. We reached the halfway stage in the program or the course and are looking this evening at the Passion narrative in real history, subtitled Compassionate Solidarity and Presence. All religions are historical. They came into being in history. They were part of history in the making. And no religion came into existence, nor does it exist or continue in a vacuum. Religions were founded in historical moments. They were shaped by history, and they continue to make contributions to history making. Now, faith, however personal, is always a communal experience. We have faith not only with others, but our faith is lived and tested and deepened in history. How we experience the sacred or nurture a consciousness of the divine or transcendent is inextricably bound up with history. We come from an historical past and are participants in history in the making. One of the first things, or one of the early things I think I learned after leaving theological college, which is too many years ago now to think, was that I could not speak, think, or live in relation to the ultimate mystery if I was not aware of history. And being in Ireland meant knowing something of Irish history, at least, and an awareness of the history of Europe, the continent of which I was a part. This awareness came after anger at beginning to discover Irish history in the community where I then lived in West Cork, and the realization that the history of Ireland had not been part of my education, secular or theological, in Northern Ireland. Faith and history are bound up together, and it is only, I think, in history that faith is shaped, it's tested, it's worked out, and it's lived. That led me, I suppose, in the end, to reread the Passion narrative that dominated so much of the Christian story, and to try and reread it in another kind of way. So I want to look now at the Passion in real history. And in much of our Western Christian tradition, the Passion of Jesus has been read outside history. It is as if history did not matter. The crucifixion has been dehistoricized. As an event in history, history has been edited out. The Passion has also been read divorced from the life and teaching of Jesus. The latter had already happened by the 4th and 5th centuries, when the creedal statements of the Constantinian Church confessed Jesus' death under Pontius Pilate, without any reference to the radical teaching and practice of Jesus and its core emphasis on compassion and justice. Well, imperial power is rarely interested in compassion and justice. The creeds might even have been more honest to have confessed crucifixion by Pontius Pilate and acknowledged the historical reality of the Roman Empire. The Church over the centuries that followed developed various theories of the death of Jesus on the cross, often using cultural images and practices of a particular time. At least they were in themselves images from history, but the crucified had already been dehistoricized. The thinking of the Western Church has been dominated for the last 1,000 years by two theories known as substitutionary atonement and penal satisfaction. The former has Jesus dying on the cross as our substitute in our place. The latter has Jesus dying on the cross to appease God's anger, to turn back God's wrath because of our sin. Now, it is only in more recent times that both theories have been questioned, not just on theological grounds, but on moral grounds. And the theories tend to portray God as violent and abusive, and women are among the sternest critics of these ways of understanding or trying to understand the death of Jesus. Taking seriously the Passion in real history begins with historical reality that Jesus was crucified by the Romans, and Rome was the empire or the superpower that ruled the world at that time. Crucifixion was an imperial form of execution, not something the Jewish people did. The Jewish temple authorities could and did stone people to death, but they never crucified people. Jesus was crucified, not stoned. Marcus Borg has put it this way: crucifixion made a statement. There were other forms of Roman capital punishment, such as beheading. Rome reserved crucifixion for two categories of people: chronically defiant slaves and others who challenged Roman rule. What they shared in common was refusing to accept established authority. Now, this crucifixion was brutal, and it was a public execution of insurrectionists by the Roman superpower. This was how the imperial part of Rome dealt with violent insurrectionists. It executed them by crucifixion. And according to the Gospel of Mark's Passion narrative, Rome executed Jesus between two insurrectionists. Dehistoricizing the death of Jesus lets the domination system off the hook and leaves imperialistic and domination power structures and practices unchallenged. The Christian Gospels are not histories or biographies of Jesus. They are documents written up to 35 to 75 years after the Romans executed Jesus. And each gospel was written to a community of faith, facing difficulties and problems, and trying to help those communities work out who Jesus was for them in their real historical life situation. Mark's was the first gospel to be written, and Matthew and Luke borrowed heavily from Mark, rearranging some of his material differently and adding another source to which Matthew and Luke had access, as well as material exclusive to each of them. Mark was a wartime gospel, written during the Jewish-Roman War, in which thousands of Jews were killed and thousands more fled into other territories. The brutal war is known by Jews as the first Holocaust, and that's why Mark has so many conflict stories in the gospel. The war was a crisis for the early Jewish followers of the Jesus movement. The founder of their movement taught and lived out active nonviolence and radical love of enemies. As Jews, could they join in this Jewish-Roman war? That they could not left them as despicable traitors in the eyes of their fellow Jewish neighbors. And the Romans were not going to pause to tell the difference between Jews and Jews of the Jesus movement. The Markan community was getting it from all sides. The Gospels are theological documents spelling out a program for life, a practice of faith. They are, though set in historical contexts, the historical context of the respective communities for which they were written, and behind that, the historical context of the Roman world in which the founder of the movement had lived and taught and was executed. Now, closer attention will need to follow to Mark, but enough for now to follow a clue, perhaps, to the reason for the imperial execution of Jesus. It locates the Passion narrative in real history. Mark has four themes which center on Jesus entering into the presence of the marginalized, those in need of healing, forgiveness, food, human touch, and welcome into community. Johnston put it this way: Mark opened his gospel by telling us why Jesus was crucified. He entered with compassion into the presence of outcasts, delivered them and brought them into community with him and others. He went against the domination of the powers and authorities who were unjustly treating all these people as unclean outcasts. So the compassionate Jesus challenging institutional justice, which Mark presents in blocks or segments of his narrative writing. And one of those segments is Mark chapter 11, verses 1 to 33, the familiar entry into Jerusalem. Palm Sunday, we know it as. And this piece of street drama, with Jesus on a donkey, the symbol of peace, and not on a war horse, which Pilate had just arrived on, at the head of Roman soldiers to quell Jewish rioting or uprising during this big festival week. Jesus at the head of a cheering Jewish crowd was high subversive drama. Then he entered the heart of the high-octane Passover week, the temple, and more high drama. He turned over the tables of the greedy money changers, part of the unjust economic system that was the religious establishment in Jerusalem, in collusion with the Roman power. Stassen again says Mark is telling us that the Jerusalem authorities conspired to have Jesus killed because he was confronting their injustice, their power and domination, and their divided loyalties, their greed for wealth. Was Jesus a violent insurrectionist, guilty of advocating violent revolution against the Roman Empire and its Jerusalem collaborators? No. It doesn't fit with the active non-violent teaching and life practice of Jesus. The entry into Jerusalem and the temple was a dramatic peace procession in opposition to the military might and violence of the Roman domination system, and a dramatic protest against the economic injustice of temple and empire that caused so much suffering among the people, the excluded, the marginalized, and the exploited. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, writing together, say that as Mark tells the story, or they ask, as Mark tells the story, was Jesus guilty of non-violent resistance to imperial Roman oppression and local Jewish collaboration? Oh yes. Mark's story of Jesus' final week is a sequence of public demonstrations against and confrontations with the domination system. And as all know, it killed him. The Passion narrative does need a theological interpretation, and the Gospels already offer that. But that is set in real historical context. It is a Passion narrative in real history, and any approach to the death or the execution of Jesus must, I think, begin there. And it is with the Passion in real history that we can look at the suffering of COVID-19 in real history. Loretta, I'm going to pause there. Let's see if there are any questions of clarification or something that maybe needs expanded a little bit more quickly before we go to groups and pick up a focused discussion question.
Johnston,
Hey.
Hello, are we all back in?
Johnston, could I ask you to repeat just that last sentence you said about COVID?
Oh yeah, it was that the Passion narrative is a narrative in real history. And it's in looking at the Passion narrative in real history not something outside of history.
Yeah.
That we can look at the suffering of COVID-19, which is in real history, real life.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry, Johnston, I was just going to ask you about
Yeah.
the little bit you said about the reasons for Jesus' execution. Who you quoted somebody and I didn't catch who you said, and I'd just like you to repeat the reasons, the 4 reasons.
Well, one of the quotes was Glenn Stassen, who's he's the late Glenn Stassen now, an American ethicist. And he's saying Mark opened his gospel by telling us why Jesus was crucified. He entered with compassion into the presence of outcasts, delivered them and brought them into community with him and others. He went against the dominations of the powers and authorities who were unjustly treating all of these people as unclean outcasts. This is after we had outlined 4 themes in Mark, where Jesus is entering into the presence of the marginalized, those who are in need of healing, those in need of forgiveness, food, human touch, welcome into community. That in the gospel, certainly Mark's gospel, and I think the others as well, Jesus very much identifies with these people and is alongside them. And being identified with them and alongside them, that puts them into confrontation with the systems and the powers and the authorities who have caused their marginalization and their suffering.
Thank you.
How did it come about, Johnson?
Yeah,
Can you hear
Marcella.
me? Yeah, how did it come about then that we always thought that Jesus had to suffer for our sins and because we had offended the Father?
Yeah. How it came about is, I think, we made the point that understandings, or they're called theories usually, theories of understanding Jesus' death, and the one that you mentioned, the substitutionary atonement, the appeasing the anger of God, etc., were theories of the death of Jesus that came into being 1,000 years ago. Those ideas and theories were not really there for the first 1,000 years. They came into being about 1,000 years ago, and they have dominated in particular through the thinking of 1,000 years ago, reinforced by, I think, the Protestant reformers in the 16th century. They've become the dominant ways of the last millennium of understanding the death of Jesus. Now, I think what they do is, critics have now said, look, these are violent ideas of God and even abusive ideas of God. And they have encouraged violence and abuse in many ways. And we ought to find other ways of trying to think, more moral ways of trying to think of the meaning of the cross. And what we're trying to do this evening is put it into historical context, put it into the context of the 1st century, not the 11th century, but the 1st century, where the Roman imperial power was the dominant power and the dominant force. But those ideas, again, they're about, it seems strange to put it this way, they're only 1,000 years old.
Mm-hmm. But Jesus knew he was going to die on the cross. He knew in advance that he was going to suffer and die.
Well, I don't think in the sense of I don't think we would say in the sense of some kind of supernatural foreknowledge, but he certainly knew, I think, insofar as we have clues from the Gospels, that if he was going to continue down the path he was traveling, this was going to be inevitable. There would be a confrontation somewhere.
Johnston, what What did people think 2,000 years ago about Jesus' death?
Yeah, a good question. One of the earliest and most dominant ways of thinking about it was that Jesus in his death and resurrection overcame powers of darkness and evil and violence.
Yes.
And it was that later was given a name by a Swedish theologian who referred to it as Christus Victor, the victory of Christ over all death-dealing things, over violence, over evil, over injustice. And that would have been that would have come out, I think, of a much more historically contextualized way of looking at the death of Jesus. The others tended to use imagery 1,000 years later, use imagery from those medieval times to try and explain the death in rather feudal terms.
Yes.
And that's what has run into difficulty. So I think the earlier theory, if you like, was of the victory of Christ over all that is evil and violent and unjust. It exposes the violence and the injustices and the domination of power.
Yes.
Is there historical evidence for Barabbas?
I don't know the answer to that, but I think we are, in the way that the story is told. The story is told of a character who, again, has got to be seen and who belongs to, and that ought to be a clue for us, that the gospel writers are trying to put something within the context of Roman imperial power and domination in that first century world. This guy belongs to some of that, at least as presented in the story, whether he was a historical character or not. He's presented in the story as somebody who comes out of that world of insurrection and opposition and rebellion against the Roman system. And there were hundreds of Barabbases.
As there were lots of Jesuses. Jesus was a common name too, wasn't it?
Sorry, Maeve.
Jesus was a common name too. There was more.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. But I mean Barabbas is a common name. Barabbas wouldn't 100 times over.
Oh yes, and
a typical character around at that time.
I'm with you, yeah.
There were movements trying always to undermine and kick out the Roman powers. Could we go to the groups, Loretto? And the question I think will probably come up on the screen. Why is it important to take seriously the Passion in real history? And what difference does it make to our living in history and being serious about history? I think we could take 15 minutes with that one. Okay, we're back in again, I think. And hopefully you had a useful discussion. Maybe we could just carry on the conversation and some folks share maybe what came up within your group or a key issue that came up in your group, or if there are further questions we want to explore, we can do that. So whoever wants to kick off. Why is it important to take seriously the Passion in real history, and what difference does it make to our living in real history?
We got a bit caught up. The conversation was nearly too short there, Johnston, because we got caught up about when did atonement, become was the crucifixion and the Passion meant to be atonement from the beginning or introduced later?
Yeah, it's again a good question, and we come to that a little later as well, briefly. In a sense, atonement is a word that has been. It's not a word we find in the narratives themselves, but it's a theological word that has been used to describe, or at least an attempt to describe, what people think was going on in the crucifixion and death of Jesus. And as we'll see later, it means at one-ment. It's a word that means bringing together in reconciliation and reconciling. And there is a sense in which when we move to Paul, and remember that Paul's letters were written some 3 decades and more before any of the Gospels were written. And it's Paul who affirms in his Corinthian correspondence that God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self. That the theological word atonement is meant to cover. So in a sense, for Paul, there was whatever the historical meaning, and he is putting it in historical context also. He's completely aware of the Roman domination system and what was going on, but the inside line, if you like, for Paul was that in about 50 CE or 50, 52, 53 CE was that God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self. There was somehow reconciliation, bringing people together in this death and resurrection that was part of the earliest thinking.
We might have been sort of confusing atonement with sort of the violent sort of nature of God, wanting like revenge.
Yeah.
That type of,
Yeah. Atonement has been associated, I think, more associated with what we said earlier, the theories that were came into being about 1,000 years ago. We tend to think of those theories as atonement, when atonement in terms of reconciliation and overcoming violence and all that separates people and creates injustice as being part of the earlier thinking. So it's easy to see how we associate atonement with what has dominated our thinking for the last 1,000 years. And if we look at the last 1,000 years of Christian thinking, particularly in the West, those theories of atonement, of substitution and appeasing the anger of God, those have dominated our thinking, they've dominated our theologies, they've dominated our hymnology, and it's very difficult to try and break out of those.
I think in our group, Johnston, hopefully I'm right in saying that.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Johnston. We felt that the original theory that Jesus died to overcome evil, and that in itself is important in terms of history. But if we look at what was happening, and we made reference to the Barabbas story, so that could be indicating that the Roman Empire, that imperialism was more scared of somebody who preached passive non-violent resistance than they were of the more sort of armed struggle, if you like, or the military wing of it. And therefore, what difference does that make to us? Well, that's a message which I guess we as usual, you go off into other discussions, but I guess by going into those discussions, we realized that that's something that the church or Christianity has not really taken seriously over the past 2,000 years. Somebody raised the issue of slavery, and why wasn't the church more focal in its opposition to it, as opposed to passively aligning with the British Empire and not necessarily resisting it. So the real difference it makes is that stark choice between living as Jesus taught us to live, or living as certainly the imperial powers would want us to live.
I think, again, when we try to put the Jesus story in history and take seriously the context of the Roman imperialism, the Roman power, and the religious authorities who were actually colluding with that domination system, then there is a lot to be overcome, and we see the confrontation and the non-violent confrontation, if you like, of Jesus with the systems and powers. I'm always haunted, I think, by Gandhi, who once said, a Hindu who was profoundly influenced by the Sermon on the Mount, that teaching of Jesus, but who said on one occasion of Jesus and his practice of active non-violence, that the only people who have never taken Jesus seriously are Christians.
Yeah.
That's right.
I find that challenging.
Yeah.
Hugely.
So
I can't think of any particular example, but I know there definitely have been places when we as Catholics or we as Protestants, but in some form of Christianity, just live alongside the unjust things that are going on in our society. And we take a long time to get any clarity about, well, this is something that is not wholesome. It is something that is really sinful. Why am I not taking part in some kind of system that will try to undo that? So I find that we as Christians, we've been very slow very often to move into a position where we take the harm and the awful anguish, and it can be physical or other anguish, and take it, allow it, let's put it that way, not literally being seen to participate in it, maybe, although sometimes maybe we did, maybe it was seen, but we kind of quietly kind of allow things to go on instead of putting our tuppence halfpenny in and saying, hey, we've got to pull up our socks and see that this is not a Christ-like way to live, and to be alongside this and not put our tuppence halfpenny in and say, and take the risk of being victimized or whatever it is we're going to suffer as a result. I think we're slow. We're still, I think that still happens. I'm slow myself. Today I find myself very slow, not responding to something that wasn't pleasant. So
part of the struggle, I think, Noreen, we somehow also imagine that our silence is neutral.
yes,
And it never is. And there is, in very ambiguous ways, we collude at times with injustices. And there have been courageous and brave people and folk who have been heroes in many ways, who have opposed wrongs, and sometimes they've been voices crying in the wilderness.
yes,
Before the institutional models catch up.
yeah.
And I think it's the institutional models that are often the slow learners or slow to become engaged.
Take the risk,
And be activated.
yeah.
Because we're tied up with power, and when it gets tied up with power, then we don't then we've a great deal more ambiguity. Paul, I think you were maybe trying to say something.
It's just it strikes me that very often Christians in general tend to support the status quo.
Okay.
Whether it be the sectarianism of Northern Ireland, the slavery of the American South, apartheid in South Africa, racism, Islamophobia, whatever causes hardship. But I think, Christians, I think, do tend to gravitate towards, as you say, power. We're attracted by power, we're attracted by influence, because it makes our life easy.
Right, thank you. That's why I suppose in some sense the collapse or death of Christendom, that model where church and empire were in bed together for 1600, 1700 years, a Western phenomenon, that the demise of that is something that it's been suggested we ought to rejoice in that, because it frees us up from the power systems and the corruption of the power systems, and can develop a more critical voice. It will remain to be seen whether we develop that voice. I think there's a struggle at the moment institutionally, and you can see it in Ireland. We haven't figured out yet what any kind of new relationship is between the church and the state, and faith and politics.
I do think that it's certainly in Northern Ireland, and I can see it happening in America now. Faith and politics, as you say, get into bed together, and they do very often create some very strange offspring.
Yeah, quite.
And it can be quite disturbing. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but
no,
yeah,
you're making
I'm
a
very
very
disturbed about because I can see a kind of Alice through the looking glass image in America of what has happened here in the past. Where religion and politics, in America, evangelical is as much a political term as it is a religious one, like Protestant in Northern Ireland.
Trump or whoever are not going to. They're going to woo that evangelical conservative wing. And I think also at the moment there's an added confusion in the American setup at the moment, because you've got the very conservative Catholic wing, and they're not with Biden; they're with Trump.
And even in Stormont at the minute, I can say, or maybe right or wrong, I don't know, but I can see Arlene's dilemma in wanting to stay with Boris Johnson, whatever he decides about shutdown and so forth. And the scientific evidence is screaming differently to her.
So what was the last line again, Maeve?
Scream the scientific evidence of the need to shut down, to shut off. Screaming at her at the minute, but yet she feels tied to Boris Johnson. There.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're actually talking about very real history in the last few minutes, and the life that
we're living it
that engages us. And I think if we, in terms of our faith, if we're prepared, if we can read that passion narrative in real history, then we are engaged with real history, and that means we're way beyond individualized, pietized issues and questions. We're engaged with big issues.
Yeah.
We've been going an hour. Why don't we? Again, we'll have a little longer in the next set of group discussions, but we'll come to that. Why don't we take a 10-minute break to make coffee or tea or whatever you drink at this time of the evening? I take it we've all returned. I think so. I want to go on in the second half and look at the Passion as a program of action, and begin by looking at the novelist Sue Monk Kidd, following her multi-million selling book The Secret Life of Bees, which is an exploration of racism and institutional racism in one of the southern states. But she's written another novel, The Book of Longings, and that is more recent, likely to be another bestseller, probably already is. And it tells the story of a rebellious young woman, a gifted writer with a questioning mind, who writes secret narratives about neglected and silenced women from her often patriarchal Hebrew Bible and similar women contemporary around her. She herself in the story is expected to marry an elderly widow to further her father's ambitions. A chance meeting with an 18-year-old Jesus changes everything. And the book ends with the words, "I am Anna. I was the wife of Jesus of Nazareth. I am a voice." It's a wonderfully written book. It's a gripping story about Anna's fate when she fights and struggles to make her woman's voice heard. Now, at one point in the book, a fever sickness has descended on Sepphoris, the Greco-Roman city where Anna lived. Sepphoris was only a few miles from Nazareth. And early in the novel, and in real history itself, the Romans had executed 2,000 Jews considered to be insurrectionists and rebels. Now Anna is in a city in a grip of a fever, and she reflects that it came like an unseen smoke, blown down from heaven to afflict the unrighteous. God has always chastised his people with plagues, fevers, leprosy, paralysis, and boils. So people said. But how could this be when the sickness bypassed father and took hold of Yalta? Yalta is Anna's beloved and very non-conformist aunt. Her father is patriarchal, oppressive, and power-hungry, in collusion with the Roman puppet ruler Herod Antipas. Anna is strangely happy when she hears that the elderly Nathaniel, to whom she has been betrothed, has fallen victim to the fever, which is claiming many lives. Then she wept when she heard that Nathaniel had survived. The rebellious young woman thinks deeply and begins to doubt the traditional explanations for fever pandemics and suffering. And she reflects to herself, ever since the conversation with my aunt that had provoked my doubts, my old understanding of God had begun to fray. New questions roiled inside me. Had God intervened to spare Nathaniel, ensuring my marriage to him? Or was his recovery merely a matter of luck and resilience? Had God caused my aunt's fever in order to chastise her, as my mother said? And when she too was restored, did it mean she'd repented? And Judas, Anna's rebellious and imprisoned brother, had God willed him to be imprisoned by Herod Antipas? And why had he failed to save Tabitha, Anna's friend? And then Anna reflects, I could no longer believe in the God of punishments and rescues. The old traditional God image is no longer fit with Anna's experience of intense community suffering. God's punishment or chastisement as an explanation of a pandemic makes no moral sense for Anna. The God who intervenes and rescues some, but not others, has no moral coherence either. Anna abandons belief in such a God. Coming back to Mark's Gospel, it was written to try and make sense of wartime suffering, and I think that is important to remember. It's a context we don't remember often, maybe. Mark is, whoever Mark was, is trying to make sense of wartime suffering. Did the suffering of the brutal Jewish-Roman war make any sense to this little community of faith? What were they to believe, and who or what was God? Mark's passion narrative wrestles with some very big questions. Mark, in the meaning-making telling of the passion narrative, quotes the opening verse from Psalm 22. It is one of ancient Israel's songs of lament. It is a cry, a prayer, or a cry for liberation. It describes a person experiencing immense suffering and intense hostility. Like Job, the sufferer does not understand why he or she is suffering, but feels forsaken by God, to whom he has been faithful. Well, here is a human experience of total abandonment by everybody, by friends, by God. There is a very deep sense of being close to death, so much so that whoever this person was in the psalm, friends are already dividing his estate among themselves. And then desperate suffering and anguished abandonment give way to a prayer of thanks for liberation and vindication. Now, when Mark used, and only used, verse 1 of the psalm and did not quote the rest of the lament except for the allusion to Jesus' clothes being divided among those who carried out the execution, did he intend his community to take the whole psalm as part of his interpretative framework? Was Mark moving from the execution of Jesus to the vindication of resurrection? I think we said it before that at times Christians have been in too much of a hurry to get to resurrection and have downplayed the raw abandonment of the Jesus experience, or the human experience of suffering. Now, this is less likely to be a case of Jesus being so divine or so close to God that he couldn't possibly suffer that much, as an inability to cope with the rawness of human suffering, especially suffering of the good or innocent, which is neither rhyme nor reason. For Mark, the anguish is real, both for Jesus and real also for his suffering community in a war situation. And putting the opening words of this lament in the mouth of the executed, dying Jesus concerns real suffering, real abandonment, and real death. Now, Mark has a rather thin resurrection narrative. It ends with a group of women in fear. No triumphal narrative here. And if Psalm 22 does end in liberation and vindication, in Mark's ending to the gospel, the vindication, it seems, is still awaited, hoped for, but not yet realized. Now, for Mark and other Christian Testament writers, Jesus in his life and teaching, death and vindication is a decisive clue to what we experience and understand as the sacred or God. Core for Mark's Jesus is the reign of God, announced right at the very beginning of the gospel, the sacred presence and action in the history and life of the world. And at the heart of the reign of God, which was the primary passion and life praxis of Jesus, were compassion and justice. Jesus entering into people's lives in Mark's narrative does so out of compassion, suffering alongside and confronting the unjust systems of empire, the domination systems, including the unjust and oppressive religious systems. Compassion stood in tenacious solidarity with the suffering, and it confronted injustice. Now, I think we've got to read Mark's narrative as whole, not an extended passion narrative with a life and teaching bit pinned on at the beginning, but a coherent narrative that is life, teaching, action, passion, and death, disclosing the reign of God, the sacred presence and action in history, real history and life. And the whole narrative is the reign of God at hand, in action. Glenn Stassen puts it this way. In the Synoptic Gospels, that's the first three Gospels we have, Jesus confronts the powers, the high priests, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, scribes, and the wealthy, confronts them 37 times for 4 kinds of injustice: exclusion of the marginalized, domination of the less powerful, oppression of the poor, and violence against enemies. Rome was the supreme governing power, dominating every aspect of life, and the kingdom of God, or the reign of God, was the alternative to the kingdom of Caesar. Jesus entered into the lives of the suffering with compassionate solidarity and confronted the powers of injustice. So the passion narrative of the cross are the ultimate acts of compassionate solidarity and confrontation of injustice and violence. As Stassen has put it, justice is crucial to our interpretation of the cross, as it is in the Gospels. So too is compassion, tenacious solidarity. It is the compassionate God of justice who is at the heart of the passion, the suffering God who enters compassionately into human suffering, confronting the powers of injustice. This Jesus discloses in his execution at the hands of the Romans and the collusion of the politico-economic and religious authorities. This Jesus discloses in his cry of desolation and abandonment, his sense of being God-forsaken. We encounter God in the suffering and know that the suffering is in God. In the community is the presence of the suffering sacred. Now, this is not in the gospel theological speculation or theological dogma. It is the passion as a program of action. The passion narrative is our narrative, our way of life in history. We become participants in life's passion narrative. The story becomes our story. The passion is understood as atonement in traditional language, at-one-ment, the bringing together in community, reconciled and reconciling. Marcus Borg has said, Marx speaks of participatory atonement. We are called not simply to believe that Jesus has done it for us, but to participate in his passion. That is the way of becoming at one with God. So participation in the passion becomes our way of life, our praxis. The passion becomes a program of action in history. We stand together as a compassionate community, at one in tenacious solidarity with those who suffer and are marginalized and vulnerable. And we are for justice, confronting the powers of injustice that cause so much of the suffering and exacerbate the suffering for which at times we may have no answer. Currently, COVID-19 is our passion narrative, and compassion and justice our response and our action. Okay, we'll pause there, and I suggest we go into groups for 20 minutes, and Loretta will put a question up on the bottom of the screen, and then we'll come back for a general conversation and wind the evening up. The passion narrative is the ultimate act of compassionate solidarity and confrontation of injustice and violence. Does that help us find meaning in suffering? And how does it shape our lives, we might say, our lives in real history? The question I saw fleetingly on the bottom of the screen. So 20 minutes in groups. Okay, we're back in. Let's see what kind of conversations we had, and see if we can continue the conversation along some of the lines. Anybody want to share what was significant from your particular group?
We talked about the whole shutting down of the churches, through COVID, and yet, socially, the social injustice, the social problems, and everything need more, Christians to help more than ever. But the churches are all closing down, and where are they, and where are we, and how can we help, and what can we do, in it.
Right. As the closing down, do you think, Bernadette, been a problem for the church? Did your group think it was a problem for the churches?
Well, we think it has been. I mean, we understood that there is an element of keeping people safe as well. You can't be irresponsible, but
Yeah.
But then you're not doing all the things that you would normally maybe do to help people within the church.
Okay.
Maybe we just have had to think slightly differently about how we do church.
Mhm.
Yes.
And realize we are church.
It's not about the building.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, that's interesting. That's a whole big exploration itself. What's a different way of this community now? It's a big one. Whether there is sufficient imagination, and it would need imagination to reimagine what it means to be a faith community in a very different world, and what will probably be a very different world.
Well, it comes up, Johnston, because you're saying, what does the passion narrative say to us in terms of helping us find meaning? Certainly in the Catholic Church, can't speak for the other churches. Our church seems to have, as an institution, we'll just hunker down and wait for this to be over. And
Right.
that's not, that isn't walking with people and living with, giving witness as you go through that. Now, there will be, of course, individual acts of, charity and kindness and fellowship, etc. But institutionally, it's just, let's just hope everybody stays safe, and then when it's over, we'll get back to normal. And we can't be sure of that, and that, it seems to me to be not only a missed opportunity, but actually an abnegation of Christianity.
Right.
Because I can't imagine the application of the passion narrative to it would be, I'll see you when it's over. That's
yeah.
It's not just the Catholic Church.
No.
What's that?
No.
It's not just the Catholic Church.
Oh yeah, sure, of course. Yeah.
I don't know if that makes us feel better or worse.
Joseph said he couldn't speak for the others, but no, it's not. We're going to have to take stock somewhere, and that will be a healthy question to start to. Where have we been? And where do we head after this? And how do you apply a passion narrative to what was essentially for those little communities behind the Gospels or within the Gospels, communities of disciples, communities of resistance, communities of solidarity, and how is the passion narrative then? And Joseph began to pose that question. How do you apply that to the reality of now? Program of action.
I had a question as to whether personal suffering can be redemptive or can be redemptive for others. But there's also a view that we have already been redeemed through Christ's suffering.
Okay. we struggled a bit with the book of Job, you remember, a couple of weeks ago,
Yes.
where there was nothing actually redemptive in the suffering. That's a problem in itself.
I think it was Jesus' last words on the cross. It is accomplished. Do we really believe we are a redeemed people?
So what does it mean to be that's a very religious word. What does it mean to be redeemed?
Okay, if you want to put it in Protestant language, we are saved by God. You know, it's nothing of our doing.
Okay.
Sorry to throw it back to you.
There's another question, Maeve. No. Okay, the word redeemed has been used frequently within the ecclesial setting and within the church, but behind the word, it means liberated. But liberated for what? Liberated from what? And liberated for what? In what sense does this passion narrative liberate us from and liberate us to?
It liberates me to be a better follower of Jesus. And when I have to make decisions, I ask, sorry.
Go on, Maeve, carry on.
I ask myself, what would Jesus do and say in this situation? And very often that won't be what my church will say and do, but I have to follow my own conscience.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
I think, Johnston, that
There you
if you try to hold together the idea from Job that there's no liberation, no redemption in suffering, that it's oppressive and it's something that we should rail against. And the idea of passion as a program for action, which I think is a superb idea, then what it's suggesting to me is the challenge is to address the causes of suffering and injustice, and to try and do something about it. I mean, suffering is a reality of life, you know, whether it's a pandemic or, you know, death of someone for another reason or whatever. But it's the fact that we can resist, we can challenge, and that we can do it in solidarity or together as community. To me, that's what church is about. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Others out there?
I think what Kathy was saying is very true, because actually when you think about the vaccinations against various illnesses, very often it was through the determination to conquer this illness or to get a grip on things which actually brought about a cure. Oftentimes after many, many years of struggle and trial and error, determined people were determined not to give up, and eventually many of the illnesses that were known in days gone by are now curable. And so I think this idea of resisting and you know, confronting pain and not just accepting it as something it has to be, but trying to, in the sense we've been talking about, rail against illness and so on, is very important, because without that we would sit there and let the things happen and cures would not perhaps be found.
Yeah, thanks, Lorna. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe maybe we have reached the end of the this evening, the halfway point. There is a break next week. I can't remember for what reason, but we're not here on the 20th, but we gather again on the 27th of October, when we move to the second half of the program. The first 4 sessions we were engaged in the search for meaning. What's the meaning in suffering? And there's been a point made in the last couple of contributions that it's about resisting and doing something about it and changing things. We now move to the search for moral values, and on the 27th of October, we'll begin by looking at the moral values of religions in public life, and that will mean that we'll take a look at not just Christianity, but Judaism and Islam as well, and what they're saying about moral values in public life. So thanks again for the participation in the group discussion, for those many contributions that people have made, where we enrich each other's thought and stretch each other's imaginations. And thanks to Loretto for, again, anchoring the evening and keeping us in touch with each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye now.
Good night.
Bye.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
David's iPhone.